Well, morning, everybody. Is Western civilization under threat? So I begin with the obligatory reference to Sir Roger Scruton. Scruton asked in actually his last lecture in 2019, what is civilization? And he answered it in the following way, and I quote, "It's surely a form of connection between people, not just a way in which people understand their languages and their customs, but also the way in which they connect to each other in their day-to-day life, with a high culture built on it, works of art, literature, music, architecture, and so on." Now, 2 points perhaps emerge from that definition. First of all, it's a very broad one, not surprisingly. Man's written history is the history of civilization. It's the very structure of our collective endeavours. Western civilization is a particular form of civilization in that sense. It's the one we know best, but it isn't the only one. Chinese civilization is a great civilization. So is Islamic civilization. So is that mix of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam that produced the culture of India and Southeast Asia. And looking back at history, so also in its way was pre-Columbian Central America, civilization of terror, incredible beauty that simply melted into air as the Spanish conquistadors reached for it. And if you doubt me, think of the quote from one of Cortez's men of Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City. He said, "These great towns and shrines and buildings arising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. Our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. It was so wonderful that I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never heard of, never seen, never dreamed of before." Now, I make this point at the start because I do fear I see sometimes a tendency in some modern defenders of Western civilization to have something like a crusader mentality, for want of a better word, to assume that the Western mix, Christianity, intellectual and economic progress, aesthetic achievement, is self-evidently morally, practically and artistically superior to everywhere else and just needs to be imitated. I don't think that's quite right. There are other great civilizations. There is a critique to be made of Eurocentrism. The West has often been complacently confident of its own superiority, carelessly destructive of technologically inferior societies. Who does not now wish we could still see that lake city of Tenochtitlan or the summer palace at Beijing destroyed by the British Army in the 1860s? Now, the second point, perhaps, that emerges from those words of Sir Roger Scruton I quoted is the sheer difficulty of defining what we mean by a civilization. And his definition could hardly be more broad. Others, too, seem to shrink from that task. Famously, at the start of his TV series, standing in front of Notre Dame Cathedral, Lord Clark, Kenneth Clark, said, and I quote, "What is civilization? I don't know. I can't define it in abstract terms, but I think I can recognise it when I see it, and I'm looking at it now." Now, I suspect Lord Clark was selling himself a bit short there, to be honest, but still, the definitional task is an important one. After all, if we are to ask whether there is a threat to Western civilization, we have to define what it's a threat to. What is our civilization made up of? Is it unique Western aesthetic genius? I don't think we can honestly say so. The human spirit has produced aesthetic genius wherever, given the chance. The truth is we all prefer what we know, but great art is great art. I might prefer King's College Chapel, but I can see why others might prefer the Grand Mosque of Samarkand. Is it a unique ability to evolve and master superior technologies? Well, on a short perspective, it could seem so, but for much of history, China was the technologically superior civilization, and maybe it soon will be again, who knows? Or is it, as our opponents would say, a unique ability to project and use military force? Well, maybe there is something in that. Any reader of the great Victor Davis Hanson's Why the West Has Won will have no illusions about the ruthless determination with which Western societies, from the ancient Greeks onwards, have used military force against societies that were culturally and technologically no match for us. But I'm not sure even that is genuinely unique. Islam, after all, has certainly exhibited this capacity at times in history and again may do so again in future. Or finally, is it in our values? Our own conference programme speaks of freedom of speech as a Western idea. And certainly many on the left now seem to see the Western civilizational mission as now being about spreading LGBTQ and other group rights to all parts of the world, queering the Donbass, as one American commentator derisively put it. Yet it's obvious that for most of its history, Western civilization has existed without anything approximating to modern ideas of freedom of speech, let alone LGBT rights, or the range of political ideas and debate that we now take for granted. Now, it's easy, of course, to deconstruct. There is still something unique about the West. It has a distinctive character, and in my view, that rests on two things. First is its creative character. As I've just set out, other civilizations do have many features in common with us, but perhaps only Western civilization has all those things together. It's that ability to absorb others' ideas and fuse them with our own, the mix of technological and intellectual advancement, aesthetic achievement, and yes, the ruthless ability to use force at times, that has historically made us distinctive, uniquely inventive, and put us so far into the leading position. To return to Roger Scruton's last lecture, he said, I quote, "Our Western civilization is not some peculiar, narrow little obsession of people who happen to live in a certain geographical part of the world. It is an inheritance, constantly expanding, constantly including new things." The second particular feature of Western civilization is, I think, and this is crucial, the belief in the individual. Western societies preeminently have the belief, however imperfectly implemented in practice, that the individual is more important than the collective, that the individual's soul matters, that self-development, self-actualization are higher values than subordination to the needs of society. The classic Western hero, after all, is the person who stands against society, stands up for his conscience, says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And I choose that phrase of Luther's deliberately because I do actually believe these values are linked closely to the inheritance of Christian belief. Now, these two things together give modern Western civilization its relentlessly creative character, but also a deconstructive one. And I indulged in that in myself a little just now. We take ideas, we absorb them, we discard them. We're not content with a single intellectual framework. We're always questioning. We're always asking whether something is right, whether technically or philosophically, and asking how it can be improved. Now, this is, of course, a huge strength. It keeps us on our toes. It stops us getting too disconnected from empirical reality. It keeps us getting richer. But it can also, in certain conditions, be a weakness. We can come to value dissent even more than we value stability. We can come to believe something close to that nothing that exists is right, that only questioning is a valid position, and that as soon as something becomes established, it's a problem, not an achievement. And I do believe that some of these conditions prevail today. A long period of Western dominance is making us careless, and it's a carelessness that seems far from justifiable in the light of recent experience. Indeed, what struck me personally in recent years is the very fragility of our own civilization. After all, we saw the near collapse of the Western financial system in 2008. We've seen the highest debt levels in history, and they're still going upwards. We're seeing our energy system being run down. We're seeing a shooting war involving at least one nuclear power. And above all, we've got the experience of the COVID lockdowns, the constraints on speech, the shutdown of most intermediary institutions, the sudden overt emergence of untrammeled state power. And we seem very casual about all this. To return to Lord Clark, he famously said at the end of his great series, and these words are often quoted at the moment, he said, and I quote, "It's lack of confidence more than anything else that kills a civilization. We can destroy ourselves by cynicism and disillusion just as effectively as by bombs." But I fear our problem at the moment is not lack of confidence, it's almost overconfidence, even hubris about our strengths. It's as if in Western civilization we have a powerful engine to produce human wealth and happiness, but we've got so used to it just powering away that we've forgotten it needs investment, we've forgotten it needs maintenance. We've come to believe that nothing really bad can happen in Western countries. War doesn't happen, power cuts don't happen, your savings don't just disappear, you can't just be subject to house arrest. Yet all these things have happened, or could have happened, they are happening. We've got too casual about our achievements, too dismissive of our own methods and the conditions needed to maintain them, too willing to throw out historical learned experience in favour of radical change. And as a result, we're undermining what has made our societies work. What do I mean by this? The most obvious example is, of course, the casual way in which we've imported large populations from parts of the world which have little in common with Western civilization, as I've defined it, and then told ourselves not only that there's no risk in that, but that it's actively a good thing to do. I don't want to dwell on that, partly because it seems to me so obvious, and partly because its consequences seem to me to be made worse by other trends that are less commented upon. Now, the first of these for me is the lack of confidence in the extended economic order. Western civilization historically has been built on extremely small government by modern standards, and on what we would now describe as the Hayekian extended order, the web of prices, connections and collaboration between individuals in which most of Western societies have existed for most of history. Yet somehow we've come to attribute to the state the wealth and the social progress that this order has generated. We now seem to believe that we can't manage without a government that spends between a third and a half of all of the money in our countries. And the lack of belief in this extended order is, I think, shown by Kamala Harris's economic program this week, the kind of casualness about what prices mean and how the system works, which I think the Trump campaign correctly called the Maduro plan, because that is where this sort of thing takes you. We've got to a point of believing where we don't really believe anything can be done, whether it's industry, whether it's arts, whether it's protection of the poor and sick, without the state being involved. Now, in the long sweep of history, that's profoundly new, and I believe, in the long run, profoundly damaging. Second, we've decided to turn our backs on the Western inheritance of energetic growth and opportunity. We've decided instead that we as people, as a burden, the science tells us we must accommodate ourselves to our circumstances. So we have the blossoming of what I call the sustainability mindset, the net zero mentality, the anti-growth culture. So instead of making and providing ever cheaper and more abundant energy, we adjust to having less of it. Instead of finding new ways to feed ourselves through GMOs or novel food, we ban them, or some of us ban them, and go back to organics. Instead of finding faster and easier ways to travel, we make it harder to drive or fly and tell people maybe it's better to stay at home anyway. This is regression. And what history tells us that when societies regress in this way, they regress in other ways too. A shrinking economy begins to produce communalism, it produces factionalism as people try to protect their interests within a shrinking economic cake. And that trend is, I'm afraid, all too visible already. It brings more social confrontation, less readiness to help the poor, the weak, the marginalised, and I greatly fear its consequences. Third, we've decided to dismiss what we know about successful political forms in the West, by which I mean the decline in the concept of the nation state and its corollary, the growth in political imperialism and uniformity. The exponential boom in Western progress, after all, kicked off in the established nation states of Western Europe and the USA. It spread to other nations as they formed recognisable national nation states too. It turned out the Western-style, increasingly democratic nation-states were the best political form for coherent and cohesive peoples to settle their differences within an agreed framework without winner-takes-all politics. Moreover, the cultural and historical differences between these states meant that countries could experiment, they could do things differently, they could learn from each other. There was competition between Manchester liberalism and Colbertism, between German Ordo liberalism and Attlee socialism. The best ideas, at least in theory, could always win out. Now this has changed hugely too. The common view across the West is that the nation state is outdated and that collective problems require collective solutions under some form of supranational authority. The effect has been to establish imperial supranational forms of governments, either directly, as in the EU, or in a more attenuated form in the Anglosphere. These gradually remove the ability to experiment and to compete. They weaken meaningful democracy and citizen engagement in favour of a permanent bureaucratic class, which derives its authority from supranational rules outside the country, not the demos within it. Yet people generally want to be part of something. Very few of us are really capable of identifying with an international institution or a treaty. Habermas's concept of constitutional patriotism hasn't really caught on outside intellectuals, even in Germany. Instead, across much of Europe, we're seeing what happens when people lose confidence in their national identity and their nation state as a means to achieve their political aims. They revert instead to pre-national identities, regional ones, ethnic ones, religious ones, tribal ones. And this has clearly been made even more likely by the super high levels of culturally distinct immigration. I regard it as an extremely bad sign, though sadly a predictable one, that suddenly there's talk about, in the context of the riots, there's suddenly talk about, quote, the indigenous English and their rights. I see that as a further very worrying reversion to sort of tribalism and ethnicism, a pre-modern order, and it's only going to end badly if we allow it to persist. Fourth and finally, though there are many other things I could talk about, is the phenomenon of, for want of a better word, intellectual collectivism. And by this I mean the tendency of all Western governments, not just to establish their reach, to expand their reach, as I noted above, but crucially to require active citizen compliance with their goals as they do so. So obviously it's always been true that the state set laws and required them to be complied with. But with the huge expansion of the role of the state has slipped in somehow the view that the state's job is not just to set a framework but to lead a project. And moreover, a project for which, at least insofar as public funds and direction are involved, the government has the right to require positive endorsement and compliance from citizens. And this phenomenon is so widespread it often passes without explicit comment. The government funds schools, so why should they not set the values and the content of the curriculum? The government wants to stop homelessness, so why should they not control your use of your property to stop you evicting tenants and setting the terms of the contract? The government pays for childcare, so why shouldn't they organise society so as to make it more or less obligatory to use it so you can get back to work? The problem, of course, is there's no principled end to this process other than state control. The only constraint is practicability, enforceability, or that rare thing, voluntary renunciation of its powers by the state. And gradually, this changes our mindset as citizens. We slowly cease to think of ourselves as free people, as free individuals, but rather as children. People whose pocket money can be cut off for bad behaviour, as in the case of the Canadian truckers and their supporters. People who can be nudged or scared into particular courses of action. And it becomes increasingly hard to imagine a world in which we've got economic independence and where we can do as we wish with our own property, even if the government doesn't like it. Indeed, I find it hard very often even to get people to imagine, to understand that such a society could or should or did exist. So much have we all internalised the right, to the view that the state has the right to set goals for us. Yet, as I've tried to set out, Western society has been built on the very opposite. Economic and intellectual independence of individuals, doing as they wished within an agreed legal framework, pursuing their own goals, thinking their own thoughts. And if we lose that, our societies may still sort of look Western in some sense, but in substance will have reverted to something more like the other non-Western civilizations, with individuals subject to the collective, subject to societal goals that are not their own. Now, I conclude by asking how serious these threats to our civilization are, because of course all societies face threats all of the time. Some are destroyed by them and some are not. Are the threats we face fundamental? Are we just going through a bad moment and we're going to recover? Or are we, in the Toynbee sense, reaching the end of our civilization in its current form? Now, it seems to me entirely possible that parts of the West will indeed succumb to one or more of these problems and take a serious wrong step. I'm less confident than I used to be that Britain won't be one of them, unfortunately. But still, I remain optimistic. From Spengler onwards, many have predicted the decline of the West. They've all gone, but the West is still here. The future is still in our hands. It really is still up to us as peoples and individuals and voters and citizens. It's up to us whether we choose to recover our belief in the extended order and economic freedom, to largely close off non-Western migration, at least for the foreseeable future, to recover the nation state as an idea and the experimentation, the democratic culture that goes with it, and to repudiate utilitarianism and reclaim the belief in the autonomy of the individual against the power of the state. Now, I think that recovery is going to happen in some parts of the West. And as somebody said yesterday, maybe in parts of the world that aren't thought to be Western at the moment, but develop some of these trends. But I do think it's going to be a tough fight. It's one that's going to require clear-sightedness and honesty, which has been a Western strength, leadership, and above all, a willingness to face up to the situation. And as the Sibyl said to Aeneas in one of the founding works of Western literature, facilis descensus averno, the way down to hell is easy. Its gates are open night and day. But to retrace your steps, to escape again into the bright air, that's the difficult bit. That's the task. That's the hard labour. So that's the job before us. Better to face it now and get to work. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.